Hey, what's up, stock compounders? Brad here. So today we're diving into the fifth tendency in Charlie Munger's Psychology of Human Misjudgment series. It's a doozy. There's quite a lot written here. I'm not going to cover everything that's written in this section, just going to pull out some highlights. So strap in. We're in for a ride. So what is the fifth tendency? The inconsistency-avoidance tendency. The brain of man conserves programming space by being reluctant to change, which is a form of inconsistency avoidance. We see this in all human habits, constructive and destructive. Few people can list a lot of bad habits that they have eliminated, and some people cannot identify even one of these. Instead, practically everyone has a great many bad habits he has long maintained despite their being known as bad. Given this situation, it is not too much in many cases to appraise early formed habits as destiny. When Marley's miserable ghost says, "I wear the chains I forged in life," he is talking about chains of habit that were too light to be felt before they became too strong to be broken. The rare life that is wisely lived has in it many good habits maintained and many bad habits avoided or cured. And the great rule that helps here is again from Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanack. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. What Franklin here is indicating in part is that inconsistency avoidance tendency makes it much easier to prevent a habit than to change it. Also tending to be maintained in place by the anti-change tendency of the brain are one's previous conclusions, human loyalties, reputational identity, commitments, accepted role in a civilization, etc. It is not entirely clear why evolution would program into man's brain an anti-change mode, alongside his tendency to quickly remove doubt, which is the tendency we talked about in the previous video. My guess is the anti-change mode was significantly caused by a combination of the following three factors. One, it facilitated faster decisions when speed of decision was an important contribution to the survival of non-human ancestors that were prey. Two, it facilitated the survival advantage that our ancestors gained by cooperating in groups, which would have been more difficult to do if everyone was always changing responses, acting inconsistently. Number three, it was the best form of solution that evolution could get to in the limited number of generations between the start of literacy and today's complex modern life. It is easy to see that a quickly reached conclusion triggered by doubt avoidance tendency, when combined with the tendency to resist any change in that conclusion, will naturally cause a lot of errors in cognition for modern man. And so it observably works out. We all deal much with others whom we correctly diagnose as imprisoned in poor conclusions that are maintained by mental habits they formed early and will carry to their graves. So a few examples of inconsistency avoidance tendency in action. As Lord Keynes pointed out about his exalted intellectual group at one of the greatest universities in the world, it was not the intrinsic difficulty of new ideas that prevented their acceptance. Instead, the new ideas were not accepted because they were inconsistent with old ideas already in place. What Keynes was reporting is that the human mind works a lot like the human egg. When one sperm gets into a human egg, there's an automatic shut-off device that bars any other sperm from getting in. The human mind tends strongly toward the same sort of result. Max Planck. Planck is famous not only for his science, but also for saying that even in physics, the radically new ideas are seldom really accepted by the old guard. Instead, said Planck, the progress is made by a new generation that comes along less brain-blocked by its previous conclusions, right? This is the saying, science progresses one funeral at a time, largely because of this psychological bias. One of the most successful users of an antidote to first conclusion bias was Darwin. He trained himself early to intensively consider any evidence tending to disconfirm any hypothesis of his, more so if he thought his hypothesis was a particularly good one. The opposite of what Darwin did is now called confirmation bias. Darwin's practice came from his acute recognition of man's natural cognitive faults arising from inconsistency-avoidance tendency. He provides a great example of psychological insight correctly used to advance some of the finest mental work ever done. One corollary of inconsistency-avoidance tendency is that a person making big sacrifices in the course of assuming a new identity will intensify his devotion to the new identity. After all, it would be quite inconsistent behavior to make a large sacrifice for something that was no good. And thus, civilization has invented many tough and solemn initiation ceremonies, often public in nature, that intensify new commitments made. Very powerful stuff there. Talking about Ben Franklin, obviously a hero of Charlie Munger. As Ben Franklin was rising from obscurity in Philadelphia and wanted the approval of some important man, Franklin would often maneuver that man into doing Franklin some unimportant favor, like lending Franklin a book. Thereafter, the man would admire and trust Franklin more, because a non-admired and non-trusted Franklin would be inconsistent with the appraisal implicit in lending Franklin the book. It's something so simple and yet quite powerful. Okay, the last section I'm going to take from the book here. Modern education often does much damage when young students are taught dubious political notions and then enthusiastically push these notions on the rest of us. The pushing seldom convinces others. But as students pound into their mental habits what they are pushing out, the students are often permanently damaged. Educational institutions that create a climate where much of this goes on are, I think, irresponsible. It is important not to thus put one's brain in chains before one has come anywhere near his full potentiality as a rational person. So, this is one of the reasons I often hear investors not wanting to talk about their personal investment holdings. Because the more they talk about those, obviously they're going to be highlighting what's good about them, right? Because they bought them. They think highly of them. That's just going to be pounding, and it's going to be reinforcing those beliefs. And it's going to be harder to diverge from those beliefs. It's going to kind of strengthen the chains of this inconsistency avoidance tendency. So this is where you guys can buy the book if you want to. Again, I'm not an affiliate or anything. I just think, obviously, it's a fantastic book. I asked ChatGPT about inconsistency avoidance tendency. I'm just going to read. I think this is a pretty solid summary of what it is. A cognitive bias that causes people to avoid making decisions that are inconsistent with their past choices or beliefs. This tendency can lead to bad decisions because it can cause individuals to stick to their past decisions even when new information or circumstances suggest that a different choice would be more appropriate. It can also lead to a reluctance to change one's mind or admit to being wrong, right? How many of us like to admit to being wrong? Which can prevent individuals from learning and growing. So, obviously, an incredibly powerful tendency that we all have. I found these antidotes a little bit weak. So let's move on to this. Here's why inversion is so difficult to do. Munger is famous. Obviously, he's famous for a lot of things, but one of the things he says is invert, always invert. Munger tells us any year that you don't destroy one of your best loved ideas is probably a wasted year. Okay, so this is Munger going head on at inconsistency-avoidance tendency. We all love our ideas. That's why they are hard to destroy. There are a handful of mental models in psychology that make inversion difficult to do. First, humans don't like changing their minds. Charlie Munger calls this mental bias inconsistency-avoidance tendency. The moment you make a decision, you like that decision even more than you did seconds before. You don't want to be inconsistent in your beliefs, attitudes, and ideas, so when you find one you like, you tend to stick with it. This means that when you go looking for potential downside or holes in your idea, you may not give it your full effort. Okay? It's kind of like lip service, like, some of these antidotes. We hear them all the time, right? They sound nice, but how many of us actually put these things into practice? Viewing mistakes as learning opportunities. That's okay. A way to save the little face, maybe, when we're wrong, when we make mistakes. But I think very few people take this really seriously. So that's what I have to say, guys, on the number 5 tendency, inconsistency avoidance tendency. So I hope you enjoyed that one, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care.